In today's video, you're going to see some advanced Dark World tricks. What is up guys, this is Tcg Sam here, and in today's video I'm coming at you guys with an advanced Dark World guide for the new format. I'm going to be going over the new Dark World cards as well as some of the things that you may or may not have known about them. So whether or not you're new to the deck or have played it before, I hope you're able to take something away from this video. So I'm going to start right off with some general things to know, like when you're playing Dark Worlds and when you're playing against Dark Worlds. So perhaps one of the biggest strengths of the Dark World monsters is that none of their effects are actually hard ones return for the most part. So for example, if you take a look at these three big Dark Worlds, just as an example, their effects essentially don't have a once per turn on them anywhere. That means if you're able to continually discard them for effect, then you're going to be able to keep using their effects. Not to mention specifically with Rainbow and Grapha, you're able to summon them multiple times per turn. You can summon them more than once per turn. So it's just a good thing to know when you're playing against Dark World or playing Dark World. These cards are just not once per turn. I also mentioned you have to discard them for effect. Don't get cheated and don't cheat. You have to discard these for card effects, so it doesn't work if you're discarding them for cost for something like Twin Twisters, for example. You have to discard them off of something like Gates of Dark World, a danger card, or something like that. Something that discards it for effect. So that's like sort of just a few general things about Dark Worlds that you want to know beforehand. But now I'm going to be going over some specific cards in the Dark World strategy. So to start off with Cerulli, a couple of things you want to remember with this card. First of all, when its effect goes to your opponent, it actually is mandatory for you to activate. So your opponent doesn't get to choose if they want to discard one from your hand. Cerulli is mandatory trigger, and then after Cerulli's effect triggers, since it's on your opponent's side of the board, it actually triggers your effects of Dark Worlds in your hand when you discard them, so you get the bonus effect of the Dark Worlds, which is incredibly powerful. This is essentially what enables the hand loop within Dark Worlds, as well as getting like all your Dark World effects to become +1s. The Dark World players will usually return Cerulli from their opponent's side of the field to the hand with a card like Security Dragon or Akashic Magician to redo it all over again, to hand loop again for more. Just a quick note about Cerulli: if you're playing against the Dark Worlds, you have to remember that since you have a monster in your field now, it blocks your Imperm and Gamma. So that means you just won't be able to use them after it goes to your field. So you want to try to use those as soon as possible. Or you can like even consider gammaing like the Cerulli Graveyard effect or something, just so it doesn't go to your side of the field. Moving on about Genta, a couple of things about this card. It's not once return in hand to discard to search, so it follows the Dark Worlds in terms of that. But what's important to note is that you can only special summon him once per turn. That's not just by its own effect, but just in general. So for example, if you play a card like Saryuja Skuldread and you special summon him from your hand, you will not be able to special summon him off its effect once again later on. But the great thing about Genta is essentially you are pretty much always guaranteed to have two uses of like the Gates of the Dark World, because you just discard him in once, you banish him from the grave, he summons himself back, and then use a big Dark World from the grave to return it to the hand and use it again. So this is a great card for the Dark World strategy to turbo deeper into their deck, and it's just very important to remember, don't get cheated. You can only special summon them once per turn. Now a quick thing about the big Dark World monsters: these guys don't activate in the graveyard to special summon themselves. So you can do these under a card like Abyss Dweller, which is very popular this format. It also makes it so your opponent's not able to like respond to like your ability to like actually summon them from the graveyard. So if you, as long as you have this in the grave and a Dark World monster on the field, you can return. You can just return to the hand and special summon it. So it's important to know that even if you're under Dweller, you still have access to these big monsters that you're going to be able to put onto the board, as long as you're able to get them in the grave and put Dark World monsters on the field. Quick thing about Silva, you can probably get this from just reading the card, but Silva's effect to hand loop must actually occur if it's discarded by an opponent's card effect, so it doesn't trigger when you just discard it, of course. But what's also important, maybe less obvious, is that Silva actually needs to be able to successfully summon in order to hand loop your opponent. So for example, if you give your opponent a Cerulli and you discard a Silva, let's say you have 5 monster zones all full, Silva's actually not going to be able to summon itself, and then therefore you're not going to be able to get the hand loop effect. So that's very important to remember, that you need your Silva to actually be able to successfully hit the board in order to do the hand loop effect. Next up, talking about the Grapha Fusion, it actually has a floating effect. So when it's removed from the field by your opponent's card, you can special summon one Dragon Lord or Dark World that's either banished or in your graveyard, and then each player with a hand discards one. So that means if you're trying to out the Grapha, you gotta remember that your opponent will be able to summon not only a big beater back, but also be able to force you to discard one and get themselves to discard one as well. So this is a very quick thing to remember about the Grapha Fusion. So that's sort of it for like a quick rundown of like some of the biggest things I think would come up when you're playing the deck. A lot of the other interactions you can probably get from just reading the card, but yeah, it's just a couple of things that you want to remember. So now I'm going to be going over sort of the general strategy of Darkworlds and what they're trying to do as a deck. So essentially with Darkworlds, you're trying to turbo your discards as quickly as possible. You want to dig through your deck and be able to trigger your Darkworld effects again and again and again, taking advantage of the fact that they're not once per turn. So the best way to do that is with cards that discard for effect. There are a couple ones that you see right now. The Gates of the Darkworld is probably one of the best ones because it's a Darkworld card, so it's searchable by Genta and Snow. It's not a hard once per turn either, so if you get multiple copies of it, you can still use its effect multiple times. It's probably just the best because you guarantee draw one and you discard the Darkworld monster that you want from your hand to trigger its effect. Similarly to Gates of the Darkworld, Salamander Catalyzer fulfills a similar role where you're able to pick the Darkworld monster you discard from your hand, except instead of getting a draw, you get a level 4 extender, which can arguably be better or worse, but the point is, you have a way to choose which Darkworld monster you want to discard and trigger its effect while getting something out of it. That leads me to the Danger Monsters. The Danger Monsters are similar to, it's sort of like a combination of these two. They can draw cards for you, they can put bodies on the board for you, but the biggest thing about the Danger Monsters is you don't choose what you discard most of the time. So as a result, that means there's a little bit of luck involved, and for that reason, they are somewhat less consistent than these two, although they can have a higher ceiling. So just something important to remember when you're playing Darkworlds and building your deck. I would suggest probably a bigger mix of these two, the guaranteed discards, rather than like a Danger, which may or may not even hit the Darkworld monster that you want, and may or may not even draw you into the card that you want. So just a very important thing to remember when you're deck building with Darkworlds. You just want these discard outlets. I wouldn't suggest playing something like Card Destruction or Darkworld Dealings. Yes, those can be very powerful and trigger your Darkworld effects, but the biggest problem with them is that this format, there's just too many graveyard decks that have effects in the graveyard. So I would very heavily suggest not playing them unless you know for sure your opponent's actually not on one of those decks, just so you don't get punished by giving your opponent a bunch of advantage. So in addition to these discard fodders, the Darkworlds are very good at putting monsters onto the board, which means there are a couple of ways to play them. You can play a big like Link version where you go into Link monsters like Appaloosa, Nightmare Griffin, things of that nature. Or you can play like a more like a rank 8 focus build because Rainbow and Grapha are level 8. You can set up cards like Hope Harbinger, Coaching Giant Trainer, just a couple of the things that you can actually do with the Darkworld deck. Either way, going first, it's going to be able to either hand loop, set up a big board, or both. So it's a very scary deck when going first, especially when it goes off uninterrupted. Going second, Darkworlds has always had a bit of a problem just because it's hard to really establish that much like momentum when your opponent has ways to actually stop you. So a thing about the Darkworlds going second is that their strategy is probably going to revolve around somehow sort of clearing your board first with either Grapha's discard effect or summoning out big monsters to clear your board before they're able to truly go off. So just something to remember with Darkworlds. If you're going second, you want to protect your discard outlets as much as possible, just because you'll be able to guarantee effects like Grapha or Rainbow when you discard them. So if you're playing against the Darkworlds, then these cards are probably actually the cards to stop. For example, a Genta Search, like you absolutely can Ash Blossom that. That's a very, very good Ash Blossom because it stops them from getting a discard fodder and a free level 4 body on the board. Even something crazy like just negating Salamander Catalyzer. Since they reveal one of the other cards in their hand, you can negate and destroy the Salamander Catalyzer somehow. It prevents them from actually guaranteeing a Darkworld effect, which can be very important. So that's it for the general strategy of the Darkworlds. Now I'm going to be moving on to some of the cards that you can actually use to actually beat the strategy. So the biggest weakness of Darkworld, I would say right now, and the reason why it isn't doing as well is because of the amount of graveyard disruption there is right now. Those cards being cards like the Bestial Monsters and the Shizu Shufflers. These cards are incredibly powerful and are found in almost like every meta deck right now, which makes it very problematic for sticking these cards in the graveyard, especially going second. Even going first, if your opponent draws a couple of Bestials, they can knock these out of your graveyard and prevent you from looping your Darkworld cards, which can be a very big problem for you to actually build your board. So the way you beat Darkworlds, like I mentioned, you can just use cards like Druisworm and the Shizu Shufflers, any Bestial, any Shizu Shuffler. The whole deck is Dark Monsters, so being able to hit them out of the graveyard, especially cards like Rainbow and Grapha before they have a chance to summon themselves, can be very huge. Not only that, you also get a monster that threatens something on their board afterwards. Same idea with the Ishizu cards. You just want to shuffle the Darkworld, like the big Darkworlds from the graveyard, the Darkworld Fusion spell when it's in the graveyard. Just having access to that means it's very difficult for a deck like Darkworld to really re-establish them unless their hand is like full of gas, but most of the time it just won't be. So as long as you're able to side in cards like this, it can be very good for stopping them. And the great thing about these is that they're already in most people's main decks or side decks anyways, so you don't really have to change much when going against the Darkworld matchup. I guess the biggest weakness of Darkworld is since it draws and adds a lot of cards from its deck to its hand, Droll and Lockbird is probably one of the best cards, if not the best card against this deck. Just being able to draw them after their very first activation to draw or search can just honestly be like turn ending. Your opponent, a lot of the times with Darkworld, is not going to be able to end on much of a board if you're able to actually Droll and Lockbird them. But the biggest problem with Droll and Lockbird is that since it isn't the greatest against most other decks in the format, it probably won't see as much play as these other two, at least at the time of recording this video. But if you do want to stop Darkworlds, cards like these are incredibly powerful, and it's very difficult as a Darkworld player to actually play around them, which means that if Darkworld should ever become more popular, these cards are just going to be able to stop them pretty easily and make it very challenging for the Darkworld player to actually win. Alright, so that's going to do it for this Darkworld guide. Hopefully you guys learned something new, whether you're trying to play the deck or play against the deck. Hopefully there's something for everyone in this video. Let me know if you think I missed anything important in the comment section below. But I feel that this is a good starting point for most people who are just trying to pick up the deck or who are trying to play against the deck at like a smaller tournament. These are just a couple of things to remember that will definitely help you if you're in this matchup, regardless of whether you're playing against it or playing with it. So I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.